Good morning, everybody. I'm Mary Jelonic, a member of the RGK Advisory Council, and along with David Springer, director of the RGK Center, we are thrilled that you're joining us for this first event in our 20th anniversary program series. Today's program is The Power of Collaboration. For more than 30 years, I was president and CEO of the Dallas Foundation and have seen the evolution of collaboration in our nonprofit sector. When I first joined the foundation in 1987, every foundation in Dallas was proudly, and may I say, fiercely independent, and thought that nonprofits would be wary if they thought we were collaborating in our grant-making decisions. But as we all grew more experienced, both funders and grantees came to realize that as long as it was a fair and transparent process, collaboration could benefit both the nonprofits in their important work and funders in their grant making. My first experience with a funder collaborative was the 0 to 5 Funders Collaborative, which started in 2006. With 2 Dallas foundations, and then grew to 34 funders. If I had one word to describe why our collaboration worked, it would be trust. There were individual funders, there were large foundations, there were small foundations, there were corporate funders, but we all had an equal voice at the table. We all listened to each other and respected each other. That doesn't mean that we didn't have a couple of rough times that seemed like herding cats, but we got through it and significantly raised the visibility of early learning in the Dallas community. This morning, we will hear from our panelists about their experiences with the power of collaboration. But in the end, it all comes down to person-to-person relationships that allow trust and cooperation to flourish. Now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. David Springer, our RGK leader. David.
Thank you, Mary. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today as the RGK Center celebrates 20 years of blazing new trails in philanthropy, volunteerism, and nonprofit management. Your support over the years has been integral as we strive to achieve the mission that was outlined by our founding director, who many of you know, Curtis Meadows, from the outset, which is to prepare the next generation of nonprofit and philanthropic leaders. And we do that through graduate education and through research here at UT Austin on the 40 acres. We're grateful for your generous donation of time, talent, and treasure over the years. We'd like to recognize the contributions of our 20th anniversary honorees who are in attendance today, as well as the invaluable support of our advisory council members, past and present, some of whom are also with us here today. So in gathering, we hope to lift the awareness of collaboratives, connect to the on-the-ground work done by community organizations, and inspire the evolution of pooled impact as a driver for equitable change. The RGK Center recognizes our role in creating more diverse, equitable, and inclusive practices in the nonprofit space, where the voices and experiences of people of color are too often overlooked. Both in and out of the classroom, we have an obligation to promote a supportive learning environment that elevates safe and courageous forums, to put into practice new ideas, dialogue, strategies, and leadership. And part of this responsibility includes maintaining an open ear and mind around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'd like to recognize the recent opportunities that we have had at the RGK Center to address our blind spots and to grow, learn, and harness assets brought to this space by all voices. We're excited to get started with our incredible panel of guests and moderators who have joined us today. Just a few quick housekeeping notes for our time together. The main portion of this event will be recorded and is meant to be an interactive exchange of ideas. So we ask that you please remain on mute until the breakout session and encourage the use of chat in the main portion, which I see a few of us are already doing, which is great. Please direct any questions for our panelists directly to our moderators, Jeremy and Esteban, through the private chat function. So I'd now like to introduce our co-moderators, Jeremy Gregg and Esteban Delgado, who will help lay the groundwork for today's topic, the power of collaboration. Jeremy is the Dallas-based managing director at Arabella Advisors and brings a national perspective of Arabella support to a variety of funder collective models. Esteban is an alum of the empath program here at the LBJ School and serves as the program manager of the Hispanic Impact Fund for the Austin Community Foundation. We are excited to welcome his regional level perspective into the conversation, as well as his experience in leading community first funder collaboratives. So Jeremy and Esteban, thank you for joining us today and leading us through this important conversation as we explore the power of collaboration.
Thank you so much, David. It is an honor and a pleasure to be here this morning with all of you. You know, it's not every day that I feel like I get to sit in a virtual room, right, full of colleagues from all across the state to engage and to collaborate and to have conversation about some of the most pressing issues, not only in philanthropy, but also how we all can come together and collaborate to ensure that we are putting our community first, and how we can adapt our practices and our processes to ensure that we are meeting those goals and missions of each of our individual and respective organizations. As David mentioned, I'm a proud 2018 graduate of the LBJ School, and I currently work at the Austin Community Foundation, where I head up the Hispanic Impact Fund. And the Hispanic Impact Fund is a kind of a slightly different type of community funder collaborative, where we're a community collective of individual philanthropists that are both corporate and community based, right, that have come together under the single aim of uplifting, right, Latino serving nonprofits and Latino-led nonprofits, so that we can ensure that we're bridging the racial wealth divide in Central Texas. I think it's really important today, as we talk about collaborating in our communities, that we center ourselves in the time that we're currently living in, right? There's no doubt that in our current moment, we are dealing with dueling pandemics. The first being COVID-19, and the second being all of the magnification of issues that have been elucidated, right, by COVID-19, right? So what I'm talking about here is the magnification of racial injustice in our communities that has been, right, I guess highlighted, well, not I guess, but has definitely been highlighted, right, by the senseless murders of Black and brown individuals throughout our communities. And so as we talk and communicate today, I think it's really important to think about how in philanthropy we can come together and not only work together in figuring out how best to serve the community, but to ensure that we're giving community a seat at the table. I think it's been for too long that we as experts in our fields have come together and said, hey, you know, we have gone to school, or we have been in situations where we can kind of think about what the best solutions might be. And as we consistently go through these past 8 months, I think we've heard very much so from our community that they want to have a seat at that table, and that they want to help ensure that we're meeting those needs. And I think the biggest thing for us to keep in mind is to say, you know, as we think about who are the experts that are going to lead this change long term, it's recognizing that those community members, right, who are having to live through the current challenges of the time, day in and day out, are actually the experts of their own experience. And so as we think about collaboration today, and we think about what we can do differently and what we can do better, right, in the coming months and into the coming years, let's try to keep that aspect of community centered. And so again, thank you so much for being here today. I'm so excited to help lead these exciting discussions, and I'm going to turn it over to my co-moderator, Jeremy.
Well, Esteban, thank you so much, and thank you for joining me in this journey of live collaboration as we attempt to figure out how to co-moderate in an environment where we cannot see body cues, and I can't be kicked under the table for saying things. So I appreciate you making time to join us. And a huge thank you to RGK for convening this really important collaborative, and to all of our panelists and to all the guests for joining us. You all have many choices with how to spend your day, and I know that we are living in a world of an abundance of webinars, and so thank you for making time to join us today in this space. I also want to give a huge thanks to our convener, Erica Eckrizel, for pulling all of this together, for having the courage or strangeness to invite me and others to join this panel. And I want to elevate a quote that she offered when she was inviting me and inviting us to mobilize this, which is a famous African proverb of, if you want to go fast, go alone. And if you want to go far, go together. And the spirit of that is really what drives us here together today. It goes without saying that we're all facing enormous personal challenges, and we're also facing enormous community challenges and global challenges. And everything feels exacerbated because of the what Esteban very articulately elevated. And I believe, the heart of philanthropy is love of neighbor, love of mankind. And what we've experienced this year has been some of the most profound philanthropy any of us have ever experienced personally and collectively. But we've also, I think, been frustrated in a way by recognizing the limitations of what philanthropy alone can do, and what our individual effort alone can do. And however strong we might be, COVID can render us completely weak. However wealthy we can be, this pandemic can render that power very futile. And I believe if there's anything I would hope for next year, many things I think we all would hope, but that we can take lessons from this and limitations that we had and figure out how to better work together. And I'm a very proud 5th generation Texan. And I grew up in the environment that Barry so articulately described of, a very proudly independent Texas with very proud and independent foundations. And I think there's a lot of strength for that. I think we have had a lot of innovations come from that. But I think we're going to have just a remarkable panelist who've helped pioneer this field. We have an opportunity to figure out what can a Texas look like that's more collaborative, where we learn to not just say, oh, you're supporting this thing, I'll support this thing as well, but actually share resources, share knowledge, and to an extent, share power. That is one of the lessons we've learned from the racial justice uprising. Is this is not simply about charity. This is about what can we do to really fix the system, and we can't do that alone. We have to do that together. From my perspective as the managing director here at Arabella Advisors, we support hundreds of donor collaboratives around the world, and there is an incredible rising interest in this, really in every area. But there's also here in Texas, what I'm finding is there's a lot of unknowns around what donor collaboratives are. So it's challenging in a way to define what a donor collaborative is. I'll posit there's essentially 3 types that I'd like to kind of elevate as we move into this conversation. Some of them are simply just learning communities where people are working together, they're sharing knowledge, they're finding ways to say, look, you really care about homelessness, I really care about homelessness. Let's try to figure out what's going on. Who are the players in this space, and how can we learn more about this issue? Those can be formal and informal, but at a very basic, this is simply, it's a way to learn together, which is what we're all doing here today. So don't be scared that this is about joining some large fund in which you don't, that it can start as simple as just a learning collaborative. The next is it can simply be coordinated giving, where we decide to work together towards a common challenge, bringing our collective resources together in this space, coordinating in a way, but we can simply just work together independently with our own grant decisions, our own processes, if we would like. And then the third, which is really sort of what we specialize here at Arabella, where we really believe that there is tremendous power, is in the pooled fund, where we're all putting resources in together. The fund is itself moving things forward, and the fund itself is actually trying to elevate the issue, whether it's climate change or racial justice or women-owned businesses. A pooled fund has the capacity to do some really powerful things. We have some great examples of some of that coming with our panelists, but just want to set the tone of don't be scared by donor collaboratives. This is, it can be a misunderstood term, but hopefully through our examples today, you'll learn some of that. So I do want to segue over towards our remarkable panel that you all came here to hear, not to hear from me. We have some great fellow North Texans of mine, Jennifer Esterline, who's the founder and executive director of Philanthropy Advocates. We also have Nicole Small, who is the CEO of Lyda Hill Philanthropies. And then from the Central Texas, we have two great speakers from Dr. Patrick Bixler, who's the RGK Center faculty and lead researcher who helped shape the formation of the Austin Together Fund. And we also have Dennis Kavanagh, the RGK Center Advisory Council member, who's also an Austin Together Fund steering committee member. And some of these folks need no introduction. I'll allow them to kind of share some of their remarks as well, but really appreciate all of you all for making time to join us today. And with that, I will turn it over to Esteban, who has some questions for our panel, maybe to help cue up the conversation. And again, couple points of order. We're going to have some conversation now with our panel. Esteban has some questions we're going to ask. But I also would really encourage you all to use the chat, which, now speaking of chat, I appreciate the reminder from one of my colleagues. We actually have a poll that we're gonna put up right now. So thank you so much. We're gonna have a poll here, which I would love for our tech to put up there. Two quick questions. How would you describe your level of engagement with funder collaboratives? Is this a totally new concept to you? Is this something that you know and you've read about, but you've not really taken anything to formally collaborate with them? Or are you active within this space? Answering this question will help us to really understand kind of your perspective and will help our panelists to know who we're talking about. And then number two, and coming to today's session, what would you most like to hear about in the context to funder collaboratives? The fundamentals of funder collaboratives, just kind of what are they, how do they work, those kinds of things. Or two, the role that funder collaboratives can play in shifting policy. We have Jennifer and others who are great experts in that space who can speak to that. Or three, how funder collaboratives are operating in the current social, economic, and political environment. So if you could just make those two choices for us, we would really appreciate it. And I will give you guys just a moment more to fill that out. So it should have popped up in that space. And also if you have any other comments and questions, please drop those in the chat as well. So thank you for answering that poll. We can probably pull that down now, and I don't know if the results will come live, but look at that. So it looks like for 0 of you, this is a totally new concept. So I really apologize for giving the basic introduction then for it. So glad to be among friends. Looks like it's split between about half of you who have are familiar with this but haven't really participated, and over half of you are actively involved, which is excellent. And it looks like the primary issue that you're interested in is what is the role of donor collaboratives in responding to the two things that Esteban elevated, the current social, economic, and political climate. But many of you also are really interested in the role that collaboratives can play in shifting public policy, which I know will be music to Jennifer's ears, among others. So thank you so much for that. And we can close that poll there. So again, thank you guys so much for joining us. Esteban, I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here again today. I want to go ahead and kind of get us started with some questions to our panel. I'm going to start off with Nicole. And so Nicole, I wonder if you could tell us, how do you view a funder collaborative, and what does, a funder collaborative, I guess, in essence, really mean to you?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having us here today. This is one of our most favorite subjects. So Mary, thank you for asking. I think funder collaboratives, as they were just described in sort of those 3 pieces, are such a great overall description of also how we think about funder collaboratives. So as Jeremy was mentioning, I think at Live Hill Philanthropies, we actually are involved in sort of all 3 of those levels. So from a learning community example, Live is a member of the Giving Pledge, and we have, the good fortune of being able to be part of that learning community where there's no shared giving. There's actually not even collaborative giving, but it is a deep and intense learning community. And so we're able to partner with other donors and other funders to learn about the work they're doing and have it inform the work that we do. On the second one, the coordinated giving, we are proud to be part of a couple of collaboratives in that sense. I think one of the ones that has popped up during this pandemic in North Texas, and some of you who are on this today are part of this, which is North Texas Cares 2.0. And for us, that's such a great example of collaborative giving, which is during this pandemic, most of the North Texas foundations pulled together. I wouldn't say for the first time, but I would say, and Mary, you can jump in, but I think this is probably one of the largest collections of kind of funder collaboratives that we've seen in North Texas, where all of the the vast majority of donors in North Texas said, you know what, instead of trying to fund everybody separately through the pandemic and each grantee having to write, a grant application to every single funder, trying to stay in business, trying to feed people, as we know, right? Earthquakes take small cracks and make them bigger. And that's what's happened during this pandemic, whether it's health or food security, those things. So the Funder Collaborative North Texas 2.0 has been a great example of where we've been able to all share applications and we all individually fund what we want to fund, but it is coordinated because we can see what everybody else is doing. And I think it's been really wonderful for the funding community and hopefully for the grantee community, and much more efficient in getting capital to the places where it's needed most as efficiently and effectively as possible. And for us in the third category, the pooled funding, we, with several North Texas foundations, are part of, ironically, it's called the Better Together Fund. So it is a collaborative of funders to encourage collaboration of other nonprofits. And so that is an example of pooled funding, where we all pooled funding together to focus on encouraging our nonprofit community in North Texas to actually work more closely together in formal collaboration, which to us means anything that changes the way you do business for the long term. And that's been a great opportunity for us to, I look at kind of each of the above too, like if you're in a pooled fund, you're probably learning a lot from other people. It allows us to, gather expertise from other funders. And we have a small team, so the opportunity to actually do these funder collaboratives has been really powerful for us because we can learn so much from our partners. So that's how we think about it, and just putting it in the framework, Jeremy, of how you set it up.
Thank you for that, Nicole. I have a follow-up question in regards to what you were referring to with the North Texas 2.0 fund. I know we had a similar fund in Central Texas, ran through the Community Foundation and in conjunction with the United Way, the Altogether ATX fund. When we think about working with nonprofits, right, who can be the vehicles for the systematic and transformational change we want to have in communities, do you have any kind of foresight or thoughts into what some of these pooled funds or these funder collaboratives might enable us to kind of do within our communities as we look past the pandemic or past kind of disaster philanthropy that we're kind of find ourselves in at the moment?
We're actually just talking about this in our office yesterday, well, in our virtual office yesterday. I think we're actually really hopeful that, again, I think everyone's constantly during this pandemic trying to look for silver linings. And I do think one of the silver linings of this is it has encouraged and incented funders and grantees to work more closely together, because at the end of the day, right, it's not just about funder collaboratives. If we're going to solve the world's hardest problems, be it food insecurity or poverty or education, funders only have a role in that, right? Our grantees and our community leaders, we actually all need to collaborate. So, I'm hopeful that over time, these collaboratives that have come together around funding continue, because I think it's a much more effective and efficient way to deploy capital. And I also hope that we begin to think about it beyond funder collaboratives, because the reality of it is, if we're trying to solve food insecurity, in our office at least, we've got this much expertise on food insecurity, but people like the food bank have tons, and we're far better off if they're not even just funder collaboratives, but they're really community collaboratives where you take thought leaders across the subject. Because whether you're deploying capital, whether you're using that capital, whether you're serving constituents, really, if we have everybody having a seat at the table in these collaboratives, we're going to be better off. So that's where I'm hoping that we take what we've done during the pandemic and we continue to move that forward and kind of shift the power to anybody who's an expert in an area should be able to sit at the table and have these conversations if we really want to solve these problems. So that's where I'm hoping we go.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I want to turn my attention now over to Dennis. Dennis, I know that you were very instrumental in the Austin Together Fund, and wanted to kind of pose the question to you of how you kind of see the pandemic, right, affecting collaborative efforts, right? We've heard from Nicole on kind of how this has been playing out, but kind of in a broader sense, right? Like, how is the pandemic affecting, right, collaborative efforts, or do you think interest in collaboration? And if you have any kind of anecdotes to share around those issues at the moment.
Sure. I would say that the pandemic has had a significant effect on the entire nonprofit community. It has certainly stressed and strained many organizations and many communities. And so I think the willingness and the need for organizations to come together to address these issues with a smaller amount of resource is really accelerating the desire on the part of nonprofits to begin to collaborate in some way. And we're seeing that. The question is how to effectively respond to that, and we really don't have the answer, I think. I mean, we're with the Austin Together Fund, we're really trying to deal with it on kind of an opportunistic way. As opportunities present themselves to us, we're trying to evaluate them. I don't think you can just try to reach out and save organizations that are in severe financial distress. That's not going to be necessarily, the purpose of a collaboration. So we're really focused on those organizations that are coming together because they have a shared vision, for impact in the community, and it's not just around trying to meet the immediate need, but in fact that there is a larger future associated, with that collaboration. I think that's one thing. The other thing that we're also focused on, and the pandemic has an impact on it, but in terms of the racial equity question, I think in a normal sort of selection process for how we would go about identifying organizations that we would support in a collaborative effort, you tend to look for, absent some other criteria, you tend to look for organizations that are more established with significant resources and a track record and all those kinds of things that would indicate a collaboration is going to be more successful. When you do that, you screen out organizations that may have been started by people of color that are under-resourced, that don't have that track record. And so we have a very intentional opportunity filter that looks for organizations that that are not necessarily in that share those other kinds of criteria. And we're happy that we've just been supporting African American Leadership Institute, which is a relatively new collaborative organization here in Central Texas. And I think in the natural screening process, that wouldn't necessarily have been there. And so I think it's incumbent upon collaboratives of funders who are looking for opportunities to change the sort of opportunity filter to look for those types of opportunities. So.
Thank you for that, Dennis. One of the things that I think about a lot as we kind of go through this time is thinking about everyone that's been affected, right? When we talk about those that are working in public right now, the essential workers, right? We're one of the things that we're trying to do at the Community Foundation is change the narrative that, right, essential doesn't mean expendable, right, during this time. It's really interesting, right? When we ask individuals in our communities to work in public right now, we're essentially asking them to put their health and safety at odds with their economic opportunity. And I think you bring up a really great point in the sense that who better to serve, right, a community that's being expected to do so much for, the paving the way of recovery in our state than organizations that truly reflect, right, the demographics of that community. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit to how in the future funder collaboratives could essentially, right, create capacity, right, with Black and Brown leadership, right, in our communities.
Well, I think African American Leadership Institute is perhaps a good example. Their vision, I think, is to create something akin to what Leadership Austin has been doing successfully for many years, which is to provide classes and other resources for the development of leaders in the community, both for leadership positions in community affairs, but also in the corporate community. And so companies here in Central Texas are really hungry to bring in people of color into leadership positions and are having a hard time finding those. And so AALI is really focused on developing those young leaders, with resources, that will be able to fulfill those kinds of positions, and also build, I think, a culture within the city that develops leadership, in that community.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for that. I think, as this comes to mind, and we, as I kind of mentioned earlier, right, as we grapple, right, with the past 8 months and we look forward to the future, I think, right, I think you're very keen to mention that there are like short-term issues that we can tackle, right? And then there are long-term issues that we can tackle. And then I think there's the idea of advocacy and policy, and like, whoa, do we need to go and enter that space to really have transformational change, so that we're not, as a group, putting Band-Aid over Band-Aid over Band-Aid and expecting the money that we put into philanthropy in these certain areas to do what it needs to do for us long term. And so I'd love to turn the conversation over to Jen, who I had the pleasure of working with when I was over at the Meadows Mental Health Policy Institute, and we worked together over there. But Jen, I know that your bread and butter is policy and advocacy, and I'd love to pose the question to you, right? And how should funder collaboratives even, right, think about potentially entering the policy space, and is there an opportunity to really shift bipartisan policy and advocacy work as we enter a new age of philanthropy?
So thank you, Esteban. And first of all, I have to just say this feels like a family reunion. As the names and faces were popping up on the screen, I almost got emotional. I'm seeing people like Sarah Jane Renberg, and I see Curtis's name, although I can't see his face. And so many of our funders on this call who are part of our collaborative and who've been part since day one, like all of the folks from the lovely RGK Foundation and now Kosmetsky Family Foundation and RISA Foundation. So this is just a wonderful opportunity, and I'm so grateful to Erica and the team for allowing me to speak to you all. The only other thing I'll say before I answer your question, Esteban, is, I feel like in many ways, the work of philanthropy advocates was really birthed within the RGK Center all those years ago. I think I'm the class of 2001, maybe 2002. It all mixes together because I went straight from an LBJ student to work with Curtis to help set up the center, and Sarah Jane as well. And so the intersection of policy and nonprofit work and philanthropy, it was all it all came together when the RGK Center was formed. And it really helped me understand the role that nonprofits can play in policy. So it was just such a beautiful marriage. So I mean, many of you on this webinar could actually be answering this question because you're all members of philanthropy advocates, but we began in 2011, and I was working at a small family foundation in Austin, the Katie K. Harmon Foundation. I was the executive director, and my boss and benefactor, Janet Harmon, was very keen on the idea of making sure that we could figure out how to really have an impact beyond just the little bit of grant making that we were doing. So we were doing about $1 million in grant making a year and trying to break the cycle of poverty through education in 7 Central Texas counties. And as all of you on the phone know, that's a little bit of grant making dollars to do a whole lot of work. And so just about that time, the Texas legislature was going through a very difficult budget session, very much like one that we will most likely see here in 21 in January. And Janet and the rest of the board really empowered us as staff to figure out what the role of philanthropy could be in state policy, because we knew, as Esteban mentioned, if we were going to have real impact in systemic ways, we needed to engage in policy. But many of y'all on the call know that foundations don't always receive empowering messages about getting involved in policy and advocacy. A lot of times, particularly private family foundations, we hear all the reasons we shouldn't do policy and advocacy, but not a lot of how you can do it. And so really the work that we've started all those years ago and that we are now, still engaged in 10 years later, it really comes down to the fact that we can play a role, we need to play a role, but our role is limited. As Jeremy said at the outset, we are private partners in a public-private partnership with the state. And our grant making is a fraction of what the state can do in terms of its resources. Even the Gates Foundation talks about, buckets in the sea when it comes to education, grant making, and other issues they work on. So really, it was coming to the legislature, and we called up some of our friends. It was a freezing cold day. Mary remembers it well. Mary was actually our first chair at Philanthropy Advocates when it was called TGAC. And we went down to the Capitol and we talked with lawmakers to say, here are the things that we've been involved in. Here are the grants we've been making for decades. Let us tell you about some of the best practices and most promising practices in education. And when you're making really hard decisions around cuts, know that we can be a resource and a thought partner to you, because we, as private philanthropy, as community foundations, as United Ways, we have to make the same types of decisions. We have limited resources and we have lots of demands, just like the state. So we talk a lot about, the role of a program officer in a foundation is very, very similar to a staffer in a legislative office, that the body of the legislature is very similar to the board of a family foundation. And so it's the same kind of conversation. So it really was sort of a different way of engaging in policy. Many of us have often written checks to support policy and advocacy organizations, maybe policy research, maybe funding to the RGK Center, the LBJ School, but haven't really sort of rolled up our sleeves and gotten involved in the policy conversations ourselves. And that was really the point. I'm not sure we knew that at the time, but all these, a decade later, as we look back, we know that really the most important part in all of this is helping lawmakers understand that we are a resource and a thought partner, but we can't fill the holes left by the state. We are a partner in that public-private research partnership. So you asked, so let me answer one more question about the bipartisanship. The beauty of Philanthropy Advocates, we have 55 foundations now involved in our work. So again, private family foundations, community foundations, and United Ways. We represent every part of the state. We represent Republicans and Democrats. We represent organizations that fund all kinds of issues, not just education. We focus specifically as a group on education, but you could apply this model to any other issue area. And we always talk about the strength and power and safety in numbers. So it's extremely important, I think, in policy work, maybe more than any other issue area, collaboration. The fact that we can come to the Capitol as a collaborative, that when you look down the list of funders, you really can't, it's that beautiful cognitive dissonance. You really can't peg us. You can't label us as any way. Because we do represent such a swath and of the state and diversity within the work that we do. And so I think that really does give us a lot of credibility at the Capitol. And the only other thing I would say about that is there's amazing political capital among not just the foundations, the board members, the staff, but it's the grantees as well. So when you start putting together 55 foundations, plus all of their grantee networks and their partner networks, that's a pretty darn big tent. And there's nothing more important in policy advocacy work than bringing that big tent together around a shared focus. So there may be a question later on about how we do that, and that's, I think, where the hard part, where it gets really difficult, is getting down to that focus. But having a lot of folks around the same table, it does create an open opportunity for bipartisanship and collaboration and civil discourse that we all need. We all know we need a little more of that these days.
Definitely. That brings up a follow-up question for me. I think a big part of this work is, as you had mentioned, right, there are certain ideas and rightfully so, some barriers on how much we can do as philanthropy in these spaces sometimes, right? But as we start to chart right in this direction of getting involved in policy and advocacy work, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the kind of hearts and minds aspect, right? As you invite funder collaborative organizations in, right, to work with you and your organization, what are you seeing change in the mindset of what's possible, right, with some of these partner organizations? And at the same time, have you seen any shifts in the change of lawmakers who say, oh no, like Jen's organization definitely needs to come in and take on this issue. So I wonder if you could talk about that kind of shift that you're seeing, right, not only within our peers, right, but within the kind of legislative aspect of this as well.
Sure. That's a great question. I mean, I think there's certainly a movement afoot, as many of the folks on this call know. And I think Jeremy really has sort of done in a really big way through his work at Arabella Advisors. There's a shift among philanthropy to focus on systemic change. I always talk about the fact that I came from a small family foundation is really, really important and meaningful. We really were leading this work early on. We always, I can joke because my dad works at the Meadows Foundation. It wasn't the big guys, right? It was the small, scrappy foundations whose boards you kind of had nothing to lose. We didn't necessarily have the opportunity to call up a member of the legislature and get a meeting the way that some of the more well-known, more established foundations did. And so the reason I think that's important is because when we brought people on early on, it was the sort of we have nothing to lose kind of mentality. We are really, really flexible in the way we do our work. So when we invite people in, we always say, you don't have to, we have the spectrum of policy work. You can sort of play it super, super safe, or you can be sort of, torches and pitchforks running down to the Capitol. I'm joking, we don't really do that. But, there's everything on that continuum for your foundation. So we invite people to come in and learn, when Jeremy outlined the different types of collaboratives at the outset, it's very much a learning place. Pre-COVID, we were doing lots of convenings together in Austin and across the state to talk about legislative issues. And it's super, super focused on the content. But we are also working collaborative. So we do roll up our sleeves and get involved. We invest additional dollars in pooled funds that support research and advocacy work. But the idea has always been to be extremely flexible, to meet foundations where they are. And there's certainly an awareness among foundations that we have to move more toward those systemic issues. We are working on systemic issues. We need to focus on systemic solutions. And we know that policy advocacy is one strategy. It's not, we always talk about, it's a tool in the toolkit. It's not, we want you to change what you're doing, but essentially just add this to your toolkit. So I think that's sort of a lot of where foundations have come and the way that they enter into the work in that flexible way. I think on the lawmaker side, I think there's certainly an understanding. A lot of lawmakers and staffers don't even really know what you mean when you talk about philanthropy. So there's a ton of education that we do, and we do it constantly because new lawmakers are always coming in. There's always new staff. There's always new lawmakers coming in, especially after an election. So there's this constant education of what philanthropy is and isn't. Just as important is the isn't. And again, I think it does come back to we have limited resources. And even though Texas has a lot of foundations, and some of these foundations are very, very large, it really is not even a drop in the bucket when it comes to the resources required to deal with this, with these huge challenges that we have in our state, in our nation, and in our world. So a lot of it is educating lawmakers, and then we get it deep into the content. So as we put these pooled funds together and we support the data collection, the research, and the policy recommendations, we are really providing a real opportunity for lawmakers to get good, objective information, which is actually quite hard to come by. I don't think it's a surprise to anyone on this call, and maybe increasingly that's has been the issue over the last decade or so. But having that objective, partnership is really, really important to lawmakers, and they recognize pretty quickly that that's the case. That's what we can provide in terms of value.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate both of those anecdotes. One, because I think it's always important to consider, right, if we can think about ourselves getting involved in policy and advocacy work, right, what is the kind of governmental or legislative perspective on how they view us as well. And I also really appreciate, right, how you mentioned, right, you're meeting foundations and their staff, right, where they're at to bring them along on this journey, right? I think that's really important. I also think it's really important as we think about opportunities to get involved in organizations, right, like philanthropy advocates is to kind of think about what can we do as organizations ourselves in this moment to keep ourselves feeling maybe a little uncomfortable, right? Maybe policy and advocacy might be outside of your wheelhouse, but maybe this might be the moment, right, to step out and say, okay, I'm going to go and learn about this, right? Because it might be the thing that says, you know, maybe it's a little bit less of strategic impact areas that we want to focus on, and maybe it's more collaboration and capacity building and philanthropy, policy and advocacy that we want to focus on, right? This could be the moment to kind of really kind of shake up how we're doing things. So I really appreciate that. And please feel free, if anyone has any questions, to put those in the chat. I'm happy to ask those questions to our panelists as well. I'm gonna move over to Dr. Bixler and kind of pose the question as we hear about all of these things, right? Inevitably, right, there is the future to look towards. And as a kind of academic and as a researcher, I was wondering if you could kind of share with us some of your, maybe some of your foresight or predictions on what might really be some big areas that we need to be thinking about for collaboration as we move forward and into the future.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the question. Thanks everyone for having me. I'm really humbled to be here with all of this great panel and all the guests and all your years of experience out in the field. You know, I think that it's a really great question and really sort of segues kind of what I was just thinking through. I want folks to just take a second and reflect on the structural complexity of what it is that we're trying to do. There are a collaboration. There is a collaboration of pooled funds. There are pooled funds. There are pooled funds that fund collaborations of nonprofits. Those nonprofits work with clients. Those clients, you know, in some ways interact with those nonprofits. And then somewhere in that mix is what was mentioned earlier. If we think about this from the community perspective, the role of the experts, right? So there are academics, there are experts. And what we've just weaved is an incredibly complex, multi-level structure of entities, individuals, et cetera, that somehow need to figure out how to be efficient, how to work together, how to leverage each other. I think when, this is kind of really like the key, I think, following some of the recent comments, leverage each other when it makes sense to leverage, when those priorities align, when those strategies align, when those tactics align, but also know when maybe to create some distance, right? If somebody's going with pitchforks and the other folks are working from the ground up, you need to kind of be in communication, know what's going on, but maybe not in that particular time be on a consensus type page. So I just think from my perspective, it's so cool to think about a lot of the ways that I try to think about collaboration is through network structures and how can we really think about the interlinkages between these different levels of collaboration and how to find when and how that alignment happens to really drive impact. I mean, ultimately, I think it's about trying to understand better how particular configurations and collaborations really lead to meaningful change on the ground. From a research perspective, I think that's something that you know, there's a little bit of a gap in the literature for really understanding the impact and how, from an evaluation perspective, can we really lead that impact or that change on the ground to particular types of collaborations, whether that's funder collaborations, nonprofit collaborations, et cetera. So to me, that's really exciting because I think there's a huge, it's a huge growth market in terms of research ideas and better understanding, you know, how everything we're talking about really drives impact. Yep, Esteban, you're on mute.
It wouldn't be a Zoom meeting without that happening, which I'm always like, dang it, it was me. But I appreciate that. And I wonder if real quick, as you kind of maybe go through this this time of kind of assessing, right, what research has been able to kind of show and what the gaps look like, what are maybe some interesting things that you're looking forward to researching, right, in the coming months?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question, and I'll you know, to emphasize kind of what some other folks have said, I think there's a real and this is kind of a new sort of lens for me to put on, but really thinking about the equity considerations involved in collaboration, the cultural lenses that we may sort of bring to suggesting collaboration as a technique, and some potential barriers, you know, are not only thinking about under-resourced organizations, which we know that's a barrier to be able to effectively collaborate, but almost sort of those cultural lenses that may, that, you know, that certainly I as a white male may bring to the notion and the ideas of collaboration, and how are those, you know, from what different perspectives is collaboration is sort of interpreted and implemented. We currently have a study across, it's kind of across the state of Texas, but it's specifically focused on environmental nonprofits. And, you know, sort of one of the little insights from there is that a nonprofit that's reportedly led by a person of color has a significantly lower level of connections to other nonprofits, right? I don't know exactly what explains that or why that might be the case, but there might be something there, like empirically we're seeing something. And so why is that the case, right? Does it have to do with some kind of cultural conception of collaboration, and how can we maybe rewrite what we mean by that? I think that's another piece that, just to emphasize, I like how folks have talked about this real spectrum of collaboration. You know, mergers and acquisitions are pretty scary for probably every nonprofit. Sharing communication, sharing ideas, less scary, right? How can we really educate on this whole range of the ways that folks can work together? But I think, again, also just kind of adding that cultural lens, that how those different types of collaboration may be sort of interpreted and embodied in an organization in different ways.
Definitely. Well, I think just like you, I'm really interested, right, in seeing, right, if we might be able to get some kind of empirical evidence for a lot of these, you know, phenomena that we see happening in the real world. You know, I think, and also, right, being able to join that with the kind of lived experience and qualitative perspectives, right, from the community, because I know that, right, in the past, partnerships and philanthropy has been seen as potentially being a little paternalistic, right? And as we think about expanding the notion of who we are and how we can help, right, we'll really kind of shift that, right? And it's an amazing time to start collecting and to further collect data on that. Well, I want to thank everyone for fielding my questions. I know we're about to open up for some Q&A, and I'm going to pass over to Jeremy in just a second. We didn't get to one question that I was planning on asking everyone, but I want everyone to kind of keep it in the back of their head as we move into Q&A and into our breakout rooms. But it's really this aspect of how Thunder Collaboratives, right, can champion racial equity, right, as we move into what I like to call the new age of philanthropy. So don't trademark that yet, or if you do, just share the funds with me. We can open up a pooled fund together with the money. So, but I am going to go ahead and pass things over to Jeremy for a quick recap as we move into some audience Q&A.
Well, Stephen, thank you so much, and you did a great job with this format. So thank you so much for elevating that and for the great questions. Some of the comments reminded me of some of the trends that we're seeing here at Arabella in terms of the next phase that donor collaboratives can help philanthropy itself to unlock. One that I want to elevate is a great fund that exists called the Fund to Build Grassroots Power. And what the donors behind that have chosen to do is they've actually pooled their funding, put it into a fund, and then they've allowed the people who will benefit from it to choose where it goes. It is a complete acquiescence of the power and an acknowledgement of, in order to address the racial inequities and the power systems that are at play in philanthropy, we need to invite leaders from the communities themselves to do so. So there are some models out there of how to do this in a pretty significant capacity, where it's really about empowerment of the voices that matter. Concurrently with that, what we're finding is a real interest in embedding DEI principles inside of grant-making processes themselves, where to embrace diversity, equity, inclusion is not simply to give some grants to nonprofits that are in that space, but is to look at things like, if we don't accept unsolicited applications, we are necessarily not an inclusive grant maker, because we will only leverage our own network. There's benefits to that and there's downsides to that. But one of the downsides from an inclusivity standpoint is you will never hear from voices that you don't already know. If your process requires hours and hours for someone to fill out and a real nuance, and you require people to completely reinvent their application and budget into your arbitrary application, that's necessarily not equitable. An organization that lacks grant writing sophistication is not going to be able to navigate that hurdle. So we're seeing a trend in that, and donor collaboratives are pushing that. And what I'm really excited by is the way that the participants in the collaboratives that we're forming are actually changing their own policies based on that, because they're realizing through participating with others. There's this great quote from Jim Rohn that I use entirely too often, which is that we become the average of the 5 people with whom we spend the most time. And when we participate in a donor collaborative, our grant making will become necessarily more like the people with whom we are playing. And I think that's one of the things that we're really seeing. And the last big trend that we're seeing, which Nicole and Jen and others highlighted as well, is a real interest in not just putting our money together into a pot and then giving it out as grants, but really thinking about the core issues at play behind the thing that we're seeking to address through philanthropy, and a real interest in systemic change, where it's not just about philanthropy. Philanthropy is merely one tool in our impact tool belt, but also looking at advocacy, looking at policy change, and also looking, importantly, at impact investing. Saying if you have a $100 million foundation, you're giving away $5 million in grants, but what are you doing with the other $95 million? If that $100 million foundation is dedicated to women and girls issues, what if that whole corpus could be invested, as the Texas Women's Foundation has done, and investing it in women-owned businesses, so you can align your entire portfolio around impact? That's some of the things I think that we're seeing within that space. So I'd like to open up now for Q&A. We only have about 5 minutes or so before a breakout room. Again, we have the chat here if you want to drop your questions in the chat. Esteban and I will try to elevate those to our panel. One quick point of order: when the breakout room does come, there should be a little pop-up that appears on your screen with 2 choices, one of which will be what I'm calling the North Texas group, which is me and Jen and Nicole, and I believe Mary joining us on that side. The other is the Central Texas group with Esteban, Patrick, Dennis, and David in that group. So that'll come up. You should be able to choose if you weren't able to choose before the panel when that comes up. But I do see one question from Sarah. She wanted to know, and this is a great question. So this came from a member, not from me, in case anyone is concerned about this. Are there good examples of donor collaborations that didn't work? Let me see, where good, just examples of like challenges that you faced inside of that. So anyone have anything to offer within that? Not pointing any fingers or naming names, but maybe not saying specifically one didn't work, but what are some of the challenges that you had to uncover when entering some of these collaboratives?
Well, I can speak to that. We're part of a national group. I'll actually leave them unnamed, and it's not that it hasn't worked, because in fact, being part of a national collaborative for us has introduced us to all sorts of new opportunities that we have never seen. We have seen some challenges being, and this is a group that's collaborative funding, not pooled funding. We have found that there are some challenges when it's collaborative funding. Pooled funding is easier because everyone puts their money in, there's a single grant application, there's a single kind of grant contract. In the larger national collaborative that we're in, it's fairly large gifts, and each organization that gives to a grantee has to develop their own set of contracts. And we have found that it's been complicated being part of a collaborative funding group where every organization that's funding has different expectations for a project. So we share looking at projects, which is great. We get introduced to things we would have never seen before. But kind of when the devil is in the details, right? And kind of executing those grants, sometimes we have found it can be complicated because the grantee, while they got to apply once, finds themselves having to do deals essentially with, it could be 3 funders, it could be 30 funders. And we have found that to be complicated. And that group that we're working with is actually spending some time this year looking at how to rework kind of the back end of this collaborative grant process, because we have run into some obstacles there where you're like, well, I would have funded that, but having not worked with them before, knowing what their overhead policies are, or something, is against what we can fund. That hasn't happened to us in particular, but it's happened to other groups. So I would raise that as, sometimes those are complicated because people have different back end processes. And I think to participate in collaboratives, your own organization has to be open to being flexible, because you have to be flexible. You have to say, we wouldn't do that usually, but because we're part of this team, like anybody who's ever played sports, right? Like I've got kids that play sports right now, like, I'm a forward. Well, sometimes you get put in defense. Like that's just the way it goes, right? And if you're part of a team, you step up and you play whatever position you're given. So I do think it's important as being part of these collaboratives that sometimes you have to, you have to offer your expertise, but sometimes you also have to play the position you're put in, right?
Yeah.
So I would just throw that out there as something that we're part of, that it didn't not work, but they're not always so easy and smooth. So just as an example.
This is Curtis Meadows. Can you all hear me?
We can hear you, Curtis.
Okay, I'm going to jump in and give you a quick example of one that didn't work from years past in philanthropy, and that was the Ford Foundation. Early on was interested in AIDS work around the nation. And they were willing to put up $20 million to match monies that would be put into a pool fund that would be then administered by a group of people in the AIDS community, who would then in turn pick and choose the allocation of that money to the various causes. They proposed that to a whole group of foundations in Texas, and got very few takers in the whole process. And the reason tended to be around the fact that donors are reluctant to give up ultimate control and or accountability for that money without knowing how exactly it's going to be spent and how exactly the results are going to match up to their hopes and aspirations for it. So there is this tension between the donor's concern that their money be spent well, and if you will, in accordance with their preferences or interests, and giving up control to another group of people who wanted to allocate it. So what happened from all of that was that those of us that were interested in this in AIDS work went ahead and continued to make our own picks and choices ourselves, but made ourselves more open to invitation to AIDS groups to come forward and ask for resources and try to make that process as simple as possible. But it did fail as a concept from Ford Foundation.
Well, Curtis, I appreciate you sharing that example. And as Jen wrote in the chat, it's always great to hear from the godfather of philanthropy here in Texas. So appreciate you for offering that. And I think it's a good illustration of the challenges that we also see at Arabella, that you cannot force a collaborative to work. And especially from a sort of national leadership perspective, coming in and saying, hey, the big brains from DC are here, or the deep check from the deep pockets from another area of town. This really needs to be, in order to thrive, something that arises from the folks who are there. We're at time, unfortunately. We're going to take a few more minutes of Q&A because I especially want to hear from Jen on this on the same question. But I would encourage some of you all to continue posting in the chat, and in a few minutes we're going to go to the breakout room. And again, just as a heads up there, that will be a more open conversation, and we really want to hear from those of you who are in the panel of your experiences within this and sharing your voices in this. But Jen, would love to hear, having participated in and managed these fun things, what are your thoughts on all this?
I never want to go after Curtis. No, I was just going to add one more thing that I think focus. I think, Nicole said it really well, but at the end of the day, you can't do everything. And so there are certain things, certain decisions that have to be made, and those can be difficult around focus. And so when we start up we work on a biennium that in alignment with the legislative cycle. And so after every legislative session, we actually survey our membership, our full 55 members, and say, okay, we're going to give you 6 options. You vote on your top 3, and then you got to stick to it. And so we've lost people over the years because, not many, but a few, because of, I think just the difficulty of aligning around a couple of key focus areas, and prioritization is always difficult.
Well, I think, again, that's where having a leader like you is also really important. One of the missing ingredients behind this is sort of you need to have that quarterback, somebody who can kind of help step in and ensure that. And one of the other challenges, particularly in a pooled fund model, is really making sure that the governing model is built the right way, so that choices are clear from the beginning. It's just like any other arrangement that you would have at a business basis, where you'd want to make sure that you can do that. So there are a couple more questions, but unfortunately we are going to now go to the breakout room. So those will pop up now. You can choose the one that you'd like to enter. And what I would ask is that once you enter, if you can please share either in the chat or aloud your name, your organization, if you're affiliated with one, your location. And then ideally in the chat, if you can offer just one thing that you've learned from today or one big question that can help drive that conversation there. So, and I'm glad everybody can come back. So just in our waning few minutes here, before we kind of turn it back over to David, I guess I will, Esteban, if you wanted to maybe offer anything that came from your group and give a quick recap there, and I'll give one from mine, then we can turn it back over to David to close us out.
Definitely. You know, I think the big takeaway from our group that Sarah had brought up that I thought was amazing was, right, the need for organizations such as RGK, but also our own organizations, to think about what kind of case studies do we have about working in this space of collaboration. Are there perspectives, right, and reports that we can get out to help kind of share and shepherd and steward you know, this work in philanthropy. And so I think that was a great perspective that came out. One other thing I wanted to share, and I know I had mentioned this in our breakout room, but as we think about philanthropy over time, right, and thinking about the idea of like failed collaboration, thinking about, okay, if something failed in the past, it might not specifically fail in the future. And thinking about what we can do differently. And I think I go back to the comment I think about donors, right? And the kind of power, right, that we as philanthropists might want to kind of keep in this process. And I keep on going back and thinking about Jeremy's comment about, right, you're the makeup of the 5 people you keep around you. So if we can kind of really help people see that power of collaboration, not only working together, but of kind of releasing that power, right, to the community, I think that will be really a much stronger sector moving forward and into our kind of next iteration of what we're trying to accomplish in our communities. So I'll pass it back over to you, Jeremy.
Well, thank you so much, and appreciate that recap. And yes, if we become the average of the people with whom we spend time, I feel like I became a much smarter and more interesting person after this morning's conversation. There's so many of you all who have great voices we would love to share within this space. I was not able to call on him, but Chris Bugby from One Star Foundation has a really unique perspective on this. Lauren at the Fikes Foundation, some of her work that they're doing there. And so many of you have great contributions to make in this space. In our room, we had a really good conversation about the challenges that some collaboratives can face, but also the way that participating in a collaborative, back to that comment, also changes us, changes our institution, helps us to elevate our own perspective, helps us to see the limitations of what we can do alone, the benefit of working together, and then helps us to really explore things we may not have otherwise done. There were some great comments about the way that Mary Jelonic had, through Dallas Foundation, challenged some of the work of her collaborators at Better Together that helped not only change the collaborative, but change the way they approach their own independent work. And I think that to me is one of the great benefits of this, is it's not just that we can give better, but what we can be better through this work. So huge thanks again to Erica Eckwerzel for pulling this thing together, to the RGK Center for hosting it, to the amazing tech team behind that somehow made this thing work flawlessly, other than our moderators forgetting to hit unmute occasionally, which we both did. So thank you all so much, and thank you also to a remarkable panel. I'd love to turn it back over to David for closing remarks.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Esteban. I just want to begin by thanking Mary, Jeremy, Esteban, Nicole, Jen, Dennis, and Patrick for being such amazing moderators and panelists this morning. A couple of really quick personal shout outs for me, if I may. Curtis, great to hear your voice. Thank you for being here with us this morning and for getting this thing going 20 years ago. I need to give a little shout out to Sarah Jane Renborg, who recruited me to join RGK Center several years ago when she was the interim director. It's really just such a beautiful and sweet place to be in my career. So I want to thank you, Sarah Jane, for that. This morning has truly been energizing for me, I know, and for the RGK Center team, and I hope that it has been for you too. And so as we enter this, holiday season amidst everything that we're all navigating in our personal and our professional lives, I just want to share how grateful I am to each of you for, you all are all-stars in the work that you do. So I'm grateful for the work that you do, but really just for taking time to be with us this morning as a virtual community. It's just refreshing to get this type of group together and to have these discussions. It means a lot to us, and we're looking forward to doing more of this in 2021. So stay tuned for more details. Jeremy gave a quick shout out to our team, but I'm going to do it as well. Erica, founder of Civic Aim, who really spearheaded this entire operation to get us here this morning. Erica, thank you for all that you did. And then RGK Center team, Maura Porter, graduate of the program several years ago, and our associate director of the RGK Center. She's been here almost really from the beginning, and has so much institutional memory and is just a part of the fabric of the RGK Center. So Maura, thank you for all that you do. And then Sydney Wilburn, who's a graduate of the program as well, from the MPAF degree and the graduate portfolio program. She's our senior outreach program coordinator. And I'm pretty sure, I don't even know if Sydney's been in her office in the building. Like, we literally hired her right as the pandemic hit. She's done an amazing job. And then finally, Cara Cook, who is a current graduate student in the nonprofit portfolio program in the LBJ school, and is one of our 2 selected Kosmetsky fellows. So she is a up and coming star. She'll matriculate pretty soon. And Cara did a lot of work to get us here today as well. So just thank you, everybody. I hope that y'all have a wonderful holiday season and a safe new year with your loved ones. And we will hopefully see you again in 2021.